I just want to pick up on something to do with justification and causality, particularly justification for crime or bad behaviour, and how that figures within, well, two things: how it figures within causality, how we, the relationship between those two things, and how it features within morality and legality, I suppose. And again, this is triggered by this whole discussion about male sexual aggression, but I don't really want to focus on that. I just want to, that's a kind of jumping off point really for this series of ideas I've been thinking about. And it's really to do with, who's to blame, I guess. Who's to blame for a particular crime, or where do we assign blame? And there is there are discussions being had, not terribly well informed discussions, but discussions about either evolutionary or genetic justifications, let's put it that way, for certain crimes. That if we look to a person's genetic makeup, or if we look to the evolutionary history of that gender or that species, then we can find some causation, a chain of causation perhaps, for certain acts. And if we find that chain of causation, so the logic goes, then we've found a possible source of justification. In other words, people can make an excuse for bad behaviour because they can identify some kind of possible or spurious causal connection between, in this particular case, their evolutionary genetic origins and the action being carried out. But it's a flawed logic, I think. It's completely flawed logic, because that's not the way our morality works as far as I see. Because in a sense, I know there's two ways of looking at it. One way that we look at things is that we look at things, it seems to me, is that we look at things in terms of causality. Every action has a preceding cause. I mean, that's the fact, isn't it? And at least that's how physics works and science works, and kind of natural understandings of the world works. That if somebody, well, let's not say the person, if a billiard ball starts to move, we assume that another billiard ball's hit it, or there's some kind of forces act upon it. It's that kind of chain of causality which is the bedrock of our understanding of the natural world, really, in many ways. And I think we attribute the same thing to a certain extent, we attribute the same thing to people. We seem to say that people do things because there is something causing their action. But that cause, whatever that cause is, isn't a justification for the action. When we treat people as causal beings, as entities in the world, in the way I'm just talking about, we treat them as parts of causal chains. But when we start talking about them as moral beings, and it's really important, I think, we detach that. When we talk about one another as moral beings, we think of ourselves as intentional, autonomous agents, initiating actions acausally. When we're doing that, when we're applying those kind of moral logic, any justification is considered invalid, apart from one or two very specific cases. So if a person commits a crime of some kind, it doesn't work. It's no excuse to say that they were abused as a child. Yeah, it doesn't work. We don't use that as an excuse. It doesn't work to say that that their diet is lacking a particular ingredient. We wouldn't regard that as an excuse. That's the Twinkie plea, that's famously known as. It wouldn't work to say that they've been so saturated by pornographic images in the media or something that they were driven to do it. That would not be considered a valid excuse. We would not say they were provoked by the actions of that other person, whatever that other person was doing, to the extent that there was that they were forced to do it. That would not be an excuse. So any of these kind of causal roots, whatever they are, and we certainly wouldn't say, they have a genetic predisposition to do that. Again, that's not an excuse. So any causality is, can't be used, at least the way we talk about moral agents right now, any causality can't be used to justify an immoral act. None of it can. So, the idea that for example, evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology or genetics might provide a safe haven for criminals to hide in because they can make this excuse, my genes made me do it, is spurious. That's not the way our morality works. That's not with that. We don't let them say, my upbringing made me do it. We don't make we don't allow them to say I had too much aspartame in my Coke and that made me do it. We don't do that. We have to regard people as autonomous moral agents. So I think in a sense it's spurious. It doesn't make it any more pleasant to talk about, and it's still difficult. But and as I say, the facts are the facts, regardless of where they lie. But the facts around morality, and the way we deal with morality, and the way we imagine morality, are completely different. And there are inconsistencies. I can feel inconsistencies in myself. Every single piece of kind of science, if you like, and philosophy that I come across recently seems to suggest that free will is an illusion. Yeah, free will is an illusion. That's the idea that we have some kind of transcendent, intentional center of self, or something like that just initiates things. There's no, right now at least, there's no scientific and philosophical support for that idea. But I don't want to let it go, because having the idea of free will, it underpins a lot of our morality and underpins a lot of our legal systems. As I say, we assume that intentional agents have free will. They make free choices, even though it's not terribly well supported, as I say, by science and philosophy. But it's worth hanging on to. So there's an inconsistency there. I don't think it's an inconsistency which is a problem. It's an inconsistency which at some point in the future I imagine will be worked out. But for now at least, I certainly am operating in two different paradigms. In the moral realm, I assume that everyone is a moral agent and is responsible for their actions. And in other scientific realms or philosophical realms, I'm interested in talking about people as parts of more complex causal chains. And I just have to live with that inconsistency. And I think in a sense we all do. But I think this attempt to characterise explanation as justification is wrong, really. I can understand why people feel they need to do it, but I think it's built on a false premise.